Okay, so today you're going to be listening to audio about our text titled Black Codes. So we're going to start with that first section. Black codes were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and ensure their availability as a cheap labor force after slavery was abolished or ended during the Civil War. The Union victory had given some 4 million slaves their freedom. The question of freed black status in the post-war South was still very much unresolved. Under black codes, many states required blacks to sign yearly labor contracts. If they refused, they risked being arrested, fined, and forced into unpaid labor. Outrage over black codes helped undermine, or go around, support for President Andrew Johnson and the Republican Party. Stop and jot. In your own words, describe what black codes were. So take a moment to do that. Use that first section, but in your own words, what did they do? Okay, we're down to Reconstruction begins. Okay, just first the definition of Reconstruction. This is the rebuilding of the South after the Civil War is called the Reconstruction. The Reconstruction lasted from 1865 to 1877. The purpose of the Reconstruction was to help the South, so the states of the South, become a part of the Union, the northern states. Again, we're down under the picture. When President Abraham Lincoln announced the impending, or something that is going to happen, passage of the Emancipation Proclamation in early 1863, the stakes of the Civil War shifted or changed dramatically. A Union victory would mean no less than revolution in the South, where the peculiar institution of slavery had dominated economic, political, and social life in the antebellum years. In April 1865, as the war drew to a close, Lincoln shocked many by proposing limited suffrage, or the right to vote, for African Americans in the South. So he was trying to give the right to vote to some African Americans. He was assassinated or killed days later. However, and his successor Andrew Johnson would be the one to preside or rule over the beginning of Reconstruction. And just a side note, did you know, in the years following Reconstruction, the South reestablished many of the requirements of the black codes in the form of the so-called Jim Crow laws. These remained firmly in place for almost a century, that's 100 years, but were finally abolished with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Johnson, a former senator from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union during the war, was a firm supporter of states' rights and believed the federal government had no say in issues such as voting requirements at the state level. Under his Reconstruction policies, which began in May 1865, the former Confederate states were required to uphold, or keep, the abolition of slavery, made official by the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and abolition means the ending of slavery. And they made them swear loyalty to the Union and pay off their war debt. Beyond those limitations, the states and their ruling class, traditionally dominated by white planters, were given a relatively free hand in rebuilding their own governments. So go ahead and stop and jot and look back through that text. What was the goal, or the mission of Reconstruction? What were they trying to do? Okay, now we're down to passage of the black codes. Even as former slaves fought to assert, that means state a belief or fact, their independence and gain economic autonomy during the earliest years of Reconstruction, white landowners acted to control the labor force through a system similar to the one that had existed during slavery. To that end, in late 1865, Mississippi and South Carolina enacted, or made legal, the first black codes. Mississippi's laws required blacks to have written evidence of employment for the coming year each January. If they left before the end of the contract, they would be forced either to forfeit earlier wages and were subject to arrest. In South Carolina, a law prohibited, that means stopped, blacks from holding any occupation other than farmer or servant unless they paid an annual tax of $10 to $100. This provision hit free blacks already living in Charleston and former slave artisans especially hard. In both states, blacks were given heavy penalties for vagrancy, including, that means like going away from this law, including forced plantation labor in some cases. Limits on black freedom. Under Johnson's Reconstruction policies, nearly all the southern states would enact their own black codes in 1865 and 1866. While the codes granted or gave certain freedoms to African Americans, including the right to buy and own property, marry, make contracts, and testify in court only in cases involving people of their own race, their primary purpose was to restrict blacks' labor or work and activity. Some states limited the type of property that blacks could own, while virtually all the former Confederate states passed strict vagrancy and labor contract laws, as well as so-called anti-enticement measures designed to punish anyone who offered higher wages to a black laborer already under contract. Blacks who broke labor contracts were subject to arrest, beating, and forced labor and apprenticeship. Laws forced many minors, either orphans or those whose parents were deemed unable to support them by a judge, into unpaid labor for white planters. Passed by a political system in which blacks effectively had no voice, the black codes were enforced by all white police and state militia forces, often made up of Confederate veterans of the Civil War across the South. So go ahead and stop and jot. What were 2 freedoms that the black codes restricted or stopped? What did they take away? Okay, now we're moving on to the impact of the black codes. The restrictive nature of the codes and widespread black resistance to their enforcement enraged, that means made angry, many in the North, who argued that the codes violated the fundamental principles of free labor ideology. After passing the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's veto, Republicans in Congress effectively took control of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 required Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment. That means to change. Ratify is to change. To pass, to pass the 14th Amendment, which granted equal protection in the Constitution to former slaves, and enact universal male, not female, suffrage, or the right to vote before they could rejoin the Union. The 15th Amendment, adopted or started in 1870, guaranteed that a citizen's right to vote would not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. During this period of radical Reconstruction, 1867 to 1877, blacks won election to Southern state governments and even to the U.S. Congress. As indicated by the passage of the Black Codes, however, white Southerners showed a steadfast commitment to ensuring their supremacy and the survival of plantation agriculture in the post-war years. Support for Reconstruction policies waned or went down after the early 1870s, undermined by the violence of white supremacist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK. By 1877, when the last federal soldiers left the South and Reconstruction drew to a close, blacks had seen little improvement in their economic and social status, and the vigorous efforts of white supremacist forces throughout the region had undone the political gains they had made. Discrimination would continue in America with the rise of Jim Crow laws in the 1960s, but would inspire the civil rights movement to come. Go ahead and work through your graphic organizer that we've done in class. Make sure you are getting evidence from the text and you're thinking about what is the author's purpose. Were they trying to persuade you, make you believe something, teach you something, inform you, or entertain you? And that is the end of the audio.